Another part of the screening process can be drug screening. Current legal trend is that drug testing is lawful and does not invade rights to privacy. However, again, this may be continuing to morph legally as more and more states are actually looking at legal marijuana use both for medical reasons and also in a few states actually just for private and recreational use. However, currently the federal laws and state laws tend towards being that drug testing is lawful and does not invade the right to privacy. An organization has the right to make sure that when employees are on the job, they're not under the influence of drugs, including alcohol. Employees are liable for the safety of all workers and the public at large. So this is generally what these laws are based on. The idea that once someone, if you are actually at your job site working, then the company is liable for what you do in your job. So if you are working and putting others at risk, if you are causing harm to clients, those clients can not only find you accountable for that behavior, they can actually sue or bring the entire company up for charges. And efforts are ongoing to reduce the ability to cheat on drug tests and to limit access to products that can lead to false drug tests. So there's kind of a constant battle going on between an industry that's trying to give people the ability to circumvent or cheat drug tests and screeners at various organizations coming up with better ways to detect if someone actually has been using drugs and is using drugs when they're actually at their workplace. So drug screening is lawful when one, all employees and applicants are informed and written of the company's policy regarding drug use. So most drug policies specifically are simply stating that a condition of employment, and this is actually based on that initial idea of employment at will, that an organization has the legal right to fire anyone. What's generally been found and has been legal and has become kind of accepted policy in the United States is that if a company puts in writing that a condition of employment is that the person agrees that they will not be using illegal or recreational drugs, especially at any time when they're on the work site. So, for instance, airline pilots have a zero tolerance for alcohol in their system when they're actually on the job site. And if any alcohol is found through a random drug testing, they can be fired immediately. Number two, the drug policy and the possibility of testing is included in all employee contracts. In other words, the person agrees to the policy, agrees that they can be terminated if they violate this policy, and also agree to random testing or whatever testing is suggested by the company. And number three, the drug policy is presented within the context of improving employee health and increasing the safety of the workplace. So again, most laws throughout the United States will be covered, basically will accept drug screening if all three of these conditions are put into place. And all of them are fairly easy to do and are simply require putting them into the contracts, making it a written policy that people are aware of, and framing it in that this isn't being done basically to discriminate against people that like recreational drugs, but it's specifically to improve the employee health and to increase the safety of the workplace. Okay, so let's move on from drug testing to the employment interview, both as a decision-making factor, but also as a part of screening. So a fair amount of screening may be phone interviews and also just the interview process in general as a selection tool. So when we look at interviews, we've already talked a little bit about how the first thing that we need to make sure is that interviews are structured interviews, that an unstructured interview is much less accurate at predicting any kind of outcomes that would be related to job performance via the job analysis. We're going to mainly focus now on some of the additional problems that we have when we use interviews in either screening or selection. So the first one is the social interpersonal factors. Interviewer-applicant similarity. Generally, we found is that there's a process of similarity generally results in attraction. So attraction research, and we're not even talking about, this is just social interpersonal, is that we tend to have a moderate bias towards liking people that are more similar to us. More similar in age, more similar in ethnicity, more similar in gender, more similar in background, more similar in dress style. Whatever the similarity is, the more someone is like you, the more you are initially, when you first meet them, likely to view them more positively. An attraction here is not necessarily sexual attraction. It just means the desire to build a friendship with that person. We are more open to basically forming relationships with people that are more similar, which means that that's the initial thing that happens. Is when we very first meet someone, there is some bias towards being more open and receptive, more attracted to forming and continuing a conversation with that person the more similar they are with us. That attraction then results to generally a more positive emotion and positive framing. So what now happens is that when you meet someone that's more similar to you, you initially have kind of a bias towards liking them, which also means you tend to frame or interpret whatever information they're giving you in a more positive light. So you're more likely to give them the benefit of the doubt, you're more likely to feel positively about the information they're giving you, which then results in higher ratings. And this has been well supported both in attraction research, social psychological research, but also within the interview, that one of the bigger factors predicting interview success is similarity. And that isn't necessarily discrimination and what I mean by that is that it isn't necessarily that if you're of a particular minority status that you're always seen negatively. Actually, it's a bigger predictor of simply is the person interviewing you more similar. So a white person interviewing a white person is probably going to be slightly more positive to that white person. But we find the same difference if we're talking about a black person interviewing a black person. So the similar to me effect is actually generally a stronger predictor of interview success than, for instance, racial stereotypes, gender stereotypes. Now, these effects are relatively small. So, for instance, if you're clearly a bad fit for the job, just similar to me effect is not going to get you an offer. What it really matters is in an ambiguous situation. So if you have 3 applicants that are all very similar in background and experience, but one of them is more similar to the person doing all 3 interviews, that's when we're probably going to see that small bit of bias actually result in that being the person that's chosen. So they can, as I said, they're fairly small, and they can definitely be eliminated through a couple of techniques. One of them is to have a diverse group of interviewers. So not just having one person interview, but having multiple people with multiple different backgrounds, demographic profiles doing the interviewing will often kind of mediate out these effects. Also, the more structured the interview, again, the less likely this bias is going to be determined or have an effect. So if there's a clear structured interview with behavioral anchors on the responses to where the person is then making a rating of how well the person answered each individual question, in that situation there's less room or variability for that bias to influence how that person is rated. Compared to an unstructured interview where basically it's a lot easier for someone to frame the responses in a positive if they also initially liked the person based on that similar to me effect. Additional factors in decision making on interviews, verbal and nonverbal cues. So research has found that basically nonverbal cues such as eye contact, whether the person is leaning in when they're talking, both are indicators of a more positive response. So in other words, when you have someone giving the exact same responses, if someone's giving a very good quote unquote textbook answer to a structured interview question, but they're leaning away from the interviewer and they're not making eye contact, compared to leaning in and making eye contact, that person leaning in and making eye contact is most likely going to be seen more positively, even though the answers were exactly the same. Same with verbal. Someone who's muttering, talking kind of under their breath, not very loud, very soft spoken, maybe ending sentences with a question. Those people are also going to be seen giving the exact same information less positively than someone that's a little bit more assertive, is making clear statements in their verbal style. It's also been found that when the interviewer themselves talk more, interviewees get more offers. So one of the tricks you can do as an interviewer is, again, the more you can get the interviewee to talk, the more likely they're going to enjoy the conversation. In other words, we all like talking about ourselves, and if you can get the person interviewing you to talk about themselves, they're going to probably leave that interview thinking that it was a better interview than if they weren't being asked questions about themselves. This is another area where structured interviews can kind of reduce this problem. The more structured the interview is, the more clear it is that it isn't a job to get the interviewer to talk. It's basically to respond to the options. So positive nonverbal behaviors, positive verbal behaviors, and also getting the interviewer to talk all lead to higher ratings. But again, all these effects are fairly small. They aren't going to change the difference of an unqualified versus a qualified applicant getting an offer. It's more of an ambiguous situations where there's multiple people that have very similar experiences, perform similarly on the interviews. At that point, that's when these factors matter. Nonverbal gender differences also come into play here because some of what I was talking about as far as these verbal and nonverbal cues fall a little bit on kind of masculine and feminine gender roles. So direct eye contact, for instance, is generally positive, but there is a gender difference in how it's perceived. So when men make more direct eye contact, they're generally seen as being more honest and more credible. Women are sometimes perceived as being a little bit more coercive because, again, the gender assumption is that a woman is going to be a little bit more communal, a little bit more deferring, and making less eye contact. So when a woman does, they can sometimes be seen a little bit negatively. But again, fairly small effects and only in ambiguous situations. So employment interview and decision-making factors. So the best interviews or interviewees, and a lot of research has focused on basically what makes for a positive rating from an interview. Respond fairly concisely to each item, answer each item completely, give relevant personal opinions, and keep it the subject at hand. So when confronted with a structured interview question, these are the four aspects that basically result in higher ratings. If it's a concise answer, if it completely answers the question, it gives the relevant personal opinion, so the person is weighing in on what they think about the question, but it also stays the subject at hand. Now, if the answer is not complete, if it's a rambling answer, if it doesn't involve a lot of personal experiences or opinions, and also comes off topic, usually those are going to result in lower ratings. There's also a fair amount of cognitive factors that are going on in the interviewing process. So pre-interview impressions and confirmation bias. So any information the person has about you prior to the interview is going to start to form a confirmation bias in the person. So there are going to be pre-interview impressions based on the resume, cover letter, and information they have already gathered about you. So for instance, if there was mistakes or written mistakes in your cover letter, if there was grammar mistakes, the person's already going to have a confirmation bias that you may be a little less conscientious. So even before an interview happens, there's already going to be some cognitive pre-assumptions the person has made. You've always heard first impressions matter, and they do. So basically, research has found that generally the decision of whether or not to move someone on from an interview, either further evaluation or to basically reject their application, is often made easily within the first 5 minutes. Now remember, most interviews may be 15, 30, 45, even an hour long. But generally speaking, if we stop an interview 5 minutes in, we're going to find a very high correlation with final decision, with the decision the person would make right there. And that's an example of this first impression bias. So again, it's important to come in and make a good first impression. Eye contact, nonverbal behaviors, vocal quality, how you answer the very first question, and also appearance. For every job, there's going to be prototypes and stereotypes. So for instance, if it is a professional job, there is the stereotype of what the dress style and type of person is that takes on a professional job. And again, none of these biases are going to be gigantic differences. They're mainly going to fire when there's ambiguity in the decision making. So if you fit the prototype or the stereotype of both in dress style, but also, unfortunately, ethnicity, gender, age, of the type of person that would work in this job, you're going to have an advantage in the interview process. If you don't fit that stereotype, you're going to be at a slight disadvantage. Now, some research has found, basically there's two lines of research that have looked about countering prototypes and stereotypes. One of them has found that when you violate those stereotypes, you often get kind of an advantage and a backlash at the same time. So, for instance, if you're going in for a job interview, for a job where the prototype is male in their mid-20s and you're a woman in your mid-30s. If you immediately counter those stereotypes by providing immediate information that says that you are a good fit for this job, in other words, you counter the stereotypes immediately in your responses, what's generally been found is that there is a positive effect to that. That countering those stereotypes tends to reduce the power of those stereotypes and tends to actually reduce the bias that might be held against you for violating that prototype. Generally, this is found in competency ratings or the overall ratings of a structured interview. Now, there's also research that indicates that doing this, though, can result in a likability backlash. In other words, you're given a competent rating, but also the person likes you less because you violated their assumptions of the way you're supposed to behave based on your gender roles and your age roles. Another cognitive factor that can come into play with interviews is called the contrast effects. And what this basically means that instead of holding all applicants to one standard of what a good employee would be, that each consequential interview becomes the new high mark. So, for instance, if the very first person that comes to interview, instead of holding the second person to a general template of what should be a good employee, the person now compares that second person to the first one. If the second person isn't as good, then they keep the first one as their prototype. If the second one's better, that second person becomes the prototype. What can result in this, though, is that when using the contrast effect, generally speaking, using contrast to make a determination of who you actually want to move forward in an interview process is more susceptible to a lot of these biases, both social and cognitive, we've been talking about. So the answer here often is training interviewers to not contrast employee to employee, but actually to have a job analysis based core template of what a good employee is that's based on the structured questions and how they respond to them. Generally speaking, that kind of a cognitive process of determining who moves on the interviewing process will be less susceptible to these kind of cognitive and social biases I've been talking about. Also, information recall. So the more someone is interviewing, the harder and harder it becomes to recall information about subsequent or previous interviewees. And again, training can help in this. Generally speaking, we tend to remember better the primacy and recency effect. So the very first people we interview and the very last people tend to make a better impression, and we have better formed memories. One of the ways to fight this is, because again, that would result in bias. The people being interviewed in the middle, you'll have less information for, and research has found you'll be less likely to choose. In other words, if we allow someone to do multiple interviews without training and without accounting for the information recall effect, we're generally going to find that most of the applicants hired or passed on for further evaluation are going to be either early or late interviews. Again, training and teaching the person to take basically detailed notes of each interviewer or interviewee, and then reviewing those notes can definitely reduce this bias. Individual differences. So we already kind of talked about this, but this is again that's similar to me. Applicants and appearance, there definitely is effects of appearance, both dress style, but also basically information that can be inferred about conscientiousness based on personal hygiene. Attractiveness importance tends to be varied. So generally speaking, across the board, the more attractive someone is, there is a bias preferring attractiveness in hiring. And any interview that's being done in person, there is a bit of a worry about the attractiveness becoming important. Now, it does vary based on gender, and it does vary based on the type of job. So again, it depends on the situation how much attractiveness is going to be a concern. Negative biases based on unattractiveness tends to be stronger for women. So basically, women are being held to a higher standard of requirements of attractiveness in the job interview. Age tends to not be a significant determinant unless directly tied to the actual job itself. And race seems to be more important for similarity effects than discrimination. So this isn't to say that there isn't racial discrimination in the United States in hiring. It is to say, though, that more often you'll find a larger effect simply on similarity of race effects than active discrimination. Also, it's been found across the board that regardless of whether the job requires it or not, showing conscientiousness and extroversion is often preferred and results in higher ratings. So, how to improve employment interviews? Pretty straightforward list. First, link all interview questions and make sure they're structured interview questions to a job analysis. So each question should be job relevant and should be attempting to provide information about how well someone would do a particular aspect of the job. Ask each candidate identical questions in an identical situation. So as much as possible, the structured interview of these questions, keeping people to the exact same timelines and asking people questions in a very similar situation. having anchored rating scales for the answers, pictures, examples, illustrations, anything that basically helps the interviewer realize what is a poor, an average, and a good answer to each question. Recognize that panel interviews are no more accurate than individual interviews. So there has been some efforts to try to use panel interviews, in other words, multiple interviewers interviewing one person at the same time, to try to get rid of some of these possible similarity to me effects. They've actually been found to not be very successful in doing this, which means that generally speaking, you can get the same amount of information and accuracy from individual interviewers, especially if they've been trained and are using structured interviews to get around some of these biases. Combine ratings objectively. So basically, if you have a structured interview with anchors, then also have a rating scale associated with those anchors. And at the end of the interview, have the person actually average or sum up the responses to make a decision that is based on the quantitative ratings they gave the responses. This system has been shown to be less prone to cognitive and social biases than having someone make a subjective decision based on the interview at the end. Training of interviewers, so training interviewers to take proper notes, to be aware of some of these biases, and to focus on using the structured interview properly, all result in a better decision-making structure with less bias. Document the job analysis and interview development procedures and keep them up to date. So basically, have research studies that show how a job analysis was conducted, what the findings of the job analysis were, and how that job analysis was used to guide the creation of the structured interview. And again, occasionally check, is the job analysis and the interview questions still relevant to what's being predicted in the job applicant process? And finally, provide feedback to interviewers with regards to who does well and who does not after being hired. So again, that idea of recruitment and screening, part of it is to continue the open communication, even with the people not being moved on in the hiring process, for the purposes of basically being perceived as fair, but also to allow the person to possibly have a less negative opinion of the company when they aren't actually given a position. Just as a reminder that when we're looking at the validity coefficients, though most often biodata and interviews are the two techniques, and they're towards the bottom here, that we are going to see used most in screening, that there is some value to both. Structured interviews explain about 19% of the variance in performance. Biodata, when done correctly, about 27% of the variance. So these are useful tools to do initial screening. And it also allows us to narrow down our focus to allow more expensive testing techniques, such as cognitive ability or possibly personality tests, to be administered later on in the process.